way that you figure out if somebody is real is you read about what they're producing. Well, this guy is serious. He's not just fallen out of bed and decided to be a consultant today. He's invested.
What would you have done differently if it was just a business, no podcast? How do you think things would play out by now? Josh Hugo, founder of PIQ Strategies and co-host of Leadership Limbo. Josh has spent nearly 20 years helping teams fix leadership problems that create confusion, burnout, and weak management.
In front of clients, the podcast has been a really great place for me to sharpen my iron. It's been a good laboratory to test new ideas out. But there's probably no better way to get feedback for yourself than to listen to yourself. If the only reason is to generate leads in your business, or if the only reason is to generate money.
All right, Josh, what made you decide to build the business and the podcast at the same time, PIQ Strategies?
Yeah, peak strategies. So yeah, that PIQ is like each acronym. So it stands for, people IQ. Yeah, great question. I appreciate you asking it. When you shared this with me a little bit beforehand, I was actually wondering, like, what was the timeline? And so the idea of starting my practice had been in the works for a number of years, and it took a couple of life events to kind of break through that decision to say, this is what I'm going to launch. It's a leadership consultancy practice. So I do coaching, training for leaders, leadership teams, managers. And when I got the business, I had actually started my own consulting practice a few years ago and did about 5 or 6 months of work in that space. I had left schools. So I was a school leader here in Denver and in school leadership for like 13 years. And I was a teacher prior to that. And I left and very quickly got pulled into like 2 contracts right out of the gate. So I didn't really think about business development. I was like, oh, I just put it out into the universe that I want to do contract work, and somebody calls me 2 days later and I have a job that covered my bills. And I'm like, okay, sweet. Now, I didn't really think that's how it should go.
Sure.
But I was grateful at the time. So I had no infrastructure for my business when I started this 2 years ago. I really just kind of took that role, two roles on, one small, one big. And actually, it became full-time work for a period of time. So I more or less stopped any business development. So when I jumped back out in July of 2025, I came in with a much more focused approach of like, this is really meant to be around leadership development, team culture, not just like, hey, I'm a former educational leader who can consult for you. And so as such, I took a much more like thoughtful, I think it was at least, thoughtful approach to trying to create a foundation for business development, because I knew I would have to be a little bit more intentional. I wasn't trying to just work in schools. I wasn't trying to be an educational consultant explicitly, although I do have a couple of clients and people I've supported in schools. And so I said, I have a lot of experience in this space, but it's always been internal. I haven't been running my own business for 15 years. I've been in businesses for 15 years, or organizations for 17, 18 years. So I was thinking like, well, what do I need to do out of the gate? And one of the pieces, other than like the basics, which is like, of course, have a name, have a logo, have a website, have some general like defined client profile. I said, I need to create a platform that could create a little bit of validity, I think, was kind of the goal. Like, who is this guy? I saw your post, Kenneth, the other day, maybe it was today, about, the idea of thought leadership. It's like, well, if somebody's going to hire me, they can look at my track record and it was strong, built some really successful schools, but why would you hire me? What do I know about developing leaders? And so I thought of 2 things, one of which was starting to write. And I have a blog, I have a Substack. A lot of people are doing that to kind of produce what they think about things and advice. And the other was this podcast, so Leadership Limbo. And I paired up with a good friend of mine, John Clark, who's the other co-host of this series. And he and I are both independent. We don't run a business together, but he has his own consulting practice. I have mine. And we sat down and we said, you know what would it look like for us to do this? And we're both trying to get our businesses off the ground. We have a lot to offer, we think. We have a lot to learn as well. And we could pair up and do this together. So we spent about 5 weeks, 6 weeks modeling out what we wanted to do, what we could call it. Funny story there for share that later if you'd like, about our first name that got cut out legally. But
Okay.
yeah, now I've kind of led you to that. And so yeah, we started off with the name of it called liminal leadership. Liminal is like in
Okay.
between, in betwixt, in between. And we published our first episode, maybe our second, and we got some legal cease and desist order from some guy out in, who knows, DC. Are you on the East Coast?
Yes.
Yeah, so out east. He's like, this is the name of my business, my leadership consulting business, and it's trademarked, so you can't use it.
Sure.
And I was like, well, shoot, man, we're already known by people out in DC, this podcast. I'm like, it was not, the data was not like thousands of people downloading it, but somehow he found out, so we had to change our name 3 episodes in. But that's a long answer to your question. It was a lot of things happening that kind of led me to the place of saying this fundamentally was meant to be a learning platform, or kind of that, learning
Okay.
for ourselves, but also a platform for others to learn about the work we're doing.
So you went on this whole thing, kind of left the school a little bit, started PIQ. Your friend was having his own consultancy, and you both just was thinking, oh, how do we create more validity around this whole thing? Right.
Mhm.
And collaborated, came up with the idea. The first name got cut down, but now you're moving forward. And what did you say? It was you're about 50 weeks in?
So yeah, we started, I want to say it was maybe late July. So
Okay.
we're like 38 to
Okay.
40 episodes, I think. Yeah, I haven't counted recently. John's the data guy. He tracks all of that.
That makes sense. Generally speaking, you're just, for lack of a better word, I'd say trying to get your names out there and the business out there. Is that right?
Yeah, we definitely are. That's one motivation.
Sure.
The other motivation has been, we just wanted to bring value to people. We wanted to create a shorter podcast. All of ours are 30 to 45 minutes on average. That was meant to be pretty much, let's get into the content. Let's leave people with a couple of clear ideas, tools, and strategies. They could even share it at a leadership team meeting, for example, and move on to whatever else they're doing with their day. So we wanted to do that. John and I don't currently run a business together, but we have
Right.
thought about some ideas of how to use this podcast to do that. Because our initial motivation was not to make this kind of distantly, it was like a lead generation idea. Like maybe it could generate some leads for us.
Okay.
Maybe it could become a revenue source down the road. But it was more of like a creative project that was meant to just create a little bit more visibility and legitimacy. So if somebody asks like, well, what do you know? Well, here's 5 episodes about some content you might find valuable. And it certainly has served that purpose.
Putting the value out there, showing your validity and information in the space, and kind of like thought leadership.
Yeah, I think that's one word to put it. Yeah,
Sure.
one way to put it is, ideas. We try to bring up stuff that's relevant. We try to take positions on things as opposed to just describing things. I think we sometimes share an idea that's maybe not debated, and other times we'll bring up something controversial like psychological safety, or what does servant leadership really mean? Or when you say, I want ownership for my team, are you actually doing it? So we try to bring an angle and a position into it. So I'd put it under that category of thought leadership. Yeah.
Okay. You said it's been doing pretty well so far. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of metrics, and I'm hitting a stage in my life where, I want to go too Buddhist here, but like attainment and volume and more stuff and more materials, more material possessions, or I'm like, what am I really like? What is my model to evaluate being successful? There's a lot of metrics that are out there. We've grown our listenership consistently, but it's not massive yet. We're consistent with our delivery. We've had peaks and valleys. Some weeks, like, somebody catches on, they share it with their team, and we saw like a huge surge. In other weeks, it's like pretty ho hum. So from a metric standpoint, like, I think if you're purely evaluating success based on that, we definitely have room to grow. We're definitely, we haven't made any real deep investments into the marketing side of it. We post on YouTube, we post it on LinkedIn, we share it organically, through conversations like this. When we share it out to other people who might be using it in their business, we see some surges of growth. Like I said, we haven't set out to monetize it quite yet, but we have started to explore some partnerships with a couple of interesting, well, one interesting opportunity that we're not public with yet, but it could be a really interesting way to disperse the podcast. And that wouldn't have been possible had we not had a podcast, and it's an interesting partnership with basically like a microlearning software company. So they have an app that produces nano learning. They call it nano learning within large organizations with a big video library of resources. And so we can utilize what we do on our podcast to fill out that library. And they can, a business could pull up content we do, listen to it as part of that app. And if they like what they're doing, they could theoretically reach out to us. So we've explored some of those paths, but we didn't come out of the gates with advertisements or local sponsorships or commercials from businesses out here quite yet, but we're not opposed to it. We just haven't prioritized that at this stage.
I know you said it's kind of a private thing. You're not really too public about the whole collaboration that came about, but can you discuss how exactly how it happened? Like, did they find you, or did you reach out?
Yeah, great question. It was through just some networking. I was at a conference down in Orlando, and I saw this company there, and we started talking. They were kind of just advertising as a vendor, and I talked to them, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I should talk to these guys. I didn't have this angle even. I was just like, well, you live in the world of development for teams, and what's this app all about? We started talking, and then as I learned more about what their business did, I shared that I do this, and they said, oh, interesting. And so we just had a conversation. I didn't come out trying to market the podcast. They weren't looking for a podcast necessarily to help them in their content creation, but we've had a few conversations since, and there's some good synergy, I guess would be the word, between what they're trying to do and what we're doing. So it just came, networking, getting out and talking to people, and really kind of just not trying to force anything, just kind of listening to what other people are looking for and what they're doing. And it kind of has evolved into a bit of an organic opportunity here.
That's cool. And it wouldn't have happened if you didn't have the podcast, is what
right. It wasn't like, let's create a podcast to do it. It was like, it was there. And especially because we're on this Riverside studio too, a little shout out to Riverside, but we use Riverside too. And what's really nice about this app is that, and you've been finding this, I'm sure too, is that it produces digital clips like pretty easily. And it can actually, you can prompt it to create digital clips. And since their library, this software app I'm referring to uses digital tools, we're like, well, we have that. We have, 50 plus hours of content, roughly, 40 to 50 hours of content. Not all of it would fit on this library, but it was a combination of doing the podcast and then also utilizing this digital / analog, audio format, because I used to do an analog podcast that was, that's not the right word. It wasn't done over a computer. It was done in person with just 100% audio equipment, headphones, soundboards, all of that stuff. And that would not have worked for this because they wanted a video. And since Riverside produces video with your podcast, it was a great fit.
So what if you didn't decide that you wanted to take and make a podcast and add it to kind of your whole strategy for the business, what would you have done differently if it was just a business, no podcast? How do you think things would play out by now?
Yeah, good question. I would have definitely still done this blog. I think that there's a component. I mean, everyone has so much access to digital information right now. And so if you're even remotely serious about bringing on another person, I know that you found me on LinkedIn. So I know that you looked up me on LinkedIn and then you listened to an episode and then you might have read something else. That if you're even remotely serious about talking to another person or exploring, working with them, having them support you on a project, you're going to read about them. Like, I mean, unless maybe you're completely digitally disconnected from the world, like the way that you figure out if somebody is real is you read about what they're producing, you see what they do. And it doesn't mean you have to have a huge digital footprint. I wouldn't have one. I'm barely on other social media than LinkedIn, a little bit on Substack. And I really didn't do it much for 15 years, but I knew I needed to have some of that because unless I was literally doing business in person with people who didn't care about what was online, I work nationally. So people find what I do based on what's online. So I knew I needed to do something. If I hadn't done the podcast, I believe I would have still done a blog. And it's actually an interesting question. If John wasn't available to do this podcast, I don't know if I would have done it. I had done a podcast prior to this that was with at least a second host always, and almost always, and always a guest. It was never just me in like a soliloquy talking. I don't know that I would have done that. So in terms of, opportunity, John's business getting started similar in time to mine allowed for this to happen. But I think it's an interesting question for any of your listeners, Kenneth, who might be thinking about a podcast. I do think it's worth determining what kind of model you want to use. Do you want to be a solo interviewer who just invites people on? Or do you want to always have a co-host where you can both co-interview? We found that actually people have been interested by our approach because they're like, oh, I've done a bunch of podcasts. And a lot of them were interviews like this with just one person. And they're like, I wasn't sure whether a 2-person interview would be smooth, if it would be bumpy, if it would be like people talking over each other. And at least up till now, we've gotten pretty good feedback that people feel like it's really pretty smooth. And it helps that John and I have known each other for 20 years. But I do think that your model would be a worthwhile consideration because doing it solo, I'd love to actually hear, like, what is it like as somebody who you don't have a co-host, is that right? Like you're kind of the host of the show.
Me. Well, it's pretty simple. I just do a little research, think about what my audience will be interested in hearing from the particular person that I have as a guest, generate questions around it, and just ask the questions and have a conversation. It's really simple and pretty enjoyable so far, I would say.
Yeah.
I think it's a smooth way to go about it if you don't have anybody else to talk to on a regular basis, and you can find guests fairly easily if you just do some research, and you can use AI to help find people as well. In my experience, it's been pretty smooth. I am curious what it would be like to have a co-host, but that's not something I'm experimenting right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of ways to do it. And I don't know, maybe down the road doing a solo podcast would be interesting, but I think at some point it really comes down to being able to bring in guests. I don't know. I'm sure there are people who just do their own talking podcast. But you have to be really good at that. Like I think you have to be really like knowledgeable about whatever it is you're talking about. But I don't know, man, people listen to anything. I'm surprised, like you get a couple of hardcore fans, people will follow pretty much anything, listen to anyone. So I think
Sure.
there's a lot of ways you can do it. But for your listeners who I understand are people thinking about their businesses and the role of podcasts in it and the role of marketing through other tools, I do think the partner piece has been really good for us because it allows us to exchange ideas pretty consistently, and it doesn't carry the burden of having to we can kind of prep for it. At first, we were spending at least an hour plus, like before every episode. And now we exchange some text the week before it and kind of go back and forth for 10 to 20 minutes maybe and hop on and align pretty quickly. But if you're doing it solo, that's a lot of content work you got to bring in yourself, and it could probably get kind of boring unless you have guests.
Okay. In my experience, being a single host and having guests, right now I don't even see myself as the thought leader or as the person who knows really has the authority. That's why I think it's powerful to have guests for my particular goals, because the guests are the people who are the experts. I just ask them questions and they are able to bring the value to my audience. And so I think that would be a benefit for people who don't think they may not have enough authority. Oh, I'm not a thought leader, or I don't know what I'm talking about. Get people onto the show who are thought leaders, who do know what they're talking about. Ask them questions, and there you go. There's value. That's just my angle, at least.
Yeah. No, it's good.
So with the podcast, are you continuing this indefinitely? Is there like a stopping point, an end goal? What do you think?
Yeah. I don't think we have a stopping date. We both like doing it. I think that's an important consideration that I've learned. And I think that's another piece of this partnership that has been helpful, because just like in any relationship, sometimes one person carries it for a stretch and another person carries it for a stretch. And John and I both do pretty equal amounts of work on the podcast. I would say he does a lot of our digital videos. I do all of our audio editing. But there's been phases in which, admittedly, I've been like, should we keep this going? Should we, do we need to pause it? In phases in which he's been perhaps a little bit in that boat, but we've always kind of been the other voice of like, no, let's do it. I like it. And I think that's one of the things too, is in addition to, if you don't have a partner, the other consideration I'd put out there is, why are you doing it? And if the only reason is to generate leads in your business, or if the only reason is to generate money, or if the only reason is to, grow massive followers, sure, if that's your goal, then go for it. But, there's statistics out there, or something like 90% of podcasts don't make it past 18 episodes or something like that. And, there's a lot. I mean, they're hard to keep doing. My first podcast series was called The Campfire Conversation. I started that like 4 or 5 years ago. And we did 2 years of it. We did it every month in person. And so it was great. It was about 17 to 18 episodes, and they were all pretty involved and fun. But that's as far as we got. It was just too hard to get everyone together consistently, and we lost some momentum. John and I currently feel like we like doing it. It's easy enough to do it. This new platform on Riverside has made it much easier to edit it. Like, that was a real headache when you had to digitally edit everything on like a lousy online app. And so as of right now, we have no plans to retire it. At some point, if our work, changes format, and we're both independent right now. So it's also like we can kind of speak freely. We're not out there talking crap about businesses that we used to work for or work at. Like, it's referenced sometimes of our former organizations. But we're also not like, I don't have a badge on my shirt that says, this is my business. So I can't say too much here because the corporation won't like it. And so we're both in a place right now where we can kind of speak fairly freely about what's going on. And So the circumstances at the moment make it feel like we're going to keep going. Forever is, I mean, not literally forever, unless AI can just record us and for the next 10,000 years, they just keep going. But I imagine we're going to go as long as we can.
It has come up the idea, maybe we should stop, but both of you generally come back to the conclusion, nah, we like it, let's keep doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And you have had experience with a podcast in the past, too much moving parts. It was enjoyable, but it was hard to keep up, which is fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
Now things are a lot easier with like Riverside. And so there's no intention to stop anytime soon. That's good. What, aside from like that opportunity you got in networking, is there been something that's been the most surprising thing that's come of the podcast so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I set out to do this initially with a primary goal of learning a lot. Like it's my own reflection too of like I've become a more curious person, I would say, in the last year for a lot of reasons, not just because of a podcast. But I have learned a bunch. Like it's been one of the things that in the world of consulting, as opposed to the worlds I've lived in before, so to speak, from a work world, so product management and running schools, is I was delivering in my previous roles all the time. I was delivering the work, whether it be a speech, an email, interaction with a client or with a person on my team. As a consultant, especially in the business development phase in this first year, my delivery percentage to business development is like the exact opposite. I'm probably 80 to 90% business development still. And so without as much delivery time in front of clients, the podcast has been a really great place for me to sharpen my iron. It's been a great way for me to clarify my thoughts. It's been a good laboratory to test new ideas out, but also learn as I'm doing it. Like if I'm going to share ideas with people listening, I got to be on top of it. So, it's been a good way for me to practice and actually not just practice, but to deliver during a stretch or during a chapter in which daily delivery of work looks very different than it did for the previous 20 years. So I've been surprised by the value it's provided me to refine my craft. And not just podcast craft, but like just leadership development, coaching, all of the stuff that I do in my professional work.
So the most surprising thing has been it sharpening your craft overall and helping you maybe distill and communicate your ideas more. Is that the right direction?
That's a good summary, Kenneth. Yeah, it's to distill, to synthesize, to wrestle with a way of sharing something. And because podcasts are an interesting kind of form of media, is it's not like a 30-second curated Instagram clip where every precise word, phrase, body, position matters to really gravitate people to that. Like you're working through things as you do it, especially over a 50-minute conversation, a 40-minute conversation. And so, yeah, it's just been a lot of fun for that reason. And that kind of surprised me because I wasn't expecting that to be an outcome of this process, but it certainly has.
And with that, in all that learning, in that sharpening of the knife, anything great or substantial come out of that, like that you can like pinpoint in your mind about?
Yeah, I'll answer that with two things. One, it's been helpful to have this in my back pocket when talking with people. And so, I have different marketing funnels and sales nurturing processes. And just the other day, I was like, oh, I got to record this video. What do I think about this time? I'm like, no, I have a podcast. Here's the link to it. Here's the article. Here's the episode. Here's the clip. And so being able to incorporate what I'm doing on my podcast into my sales process, into my marketing process, in conversations with people, that's been a really nice thing. And then people will listen. Most of the time, people will listen to at least an episode and they'll follow up and say, that was really good. Thanks for getting me to think about that. We skipped a week about 5 weeks ago, and my brother, who's a regular listener, he's like, "Dude, what happened to your podcast today?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "It didn't come out." I'm like, "Oh, it's the first week we've taken off in like 40 weeks." He's like, "Well, I need I need your podcast today." So it's been fun to see like how it can be incorporated into um, kind of the flow of what I'm doing in my business, as well as it's been fun to hear from people. Obviously, he's biased; he's my brother, but
Sure.
other people, not just family, who've been like, "Oh, that was good." The other thing, and I actually was thinking about this with the previous question, and something I initially learned a bunch in my first podcast. Um, I had to listen to every episode of my first podcast because I was the editor, and I didn't have um, Riverside. We had a sit down kind of, it was a bunch of guys. We'd sit around drinking whiskey and talk about all sorts of stuff. So there was just clear, like someone's dog would bark, a kid would jump in the room. So I had to listen to know when to edit. But as I listened to myself as a facilitator, as an interviewer. And I'd be like, dang, I just totally cut that guy off. Or I found myself saying the same response every time to somebody's question. Or I would ignore the response and move to the next question. And so it was fun to kind of live workshop it, because the next episode, I was like, I realized, Jamel, last week when you talked, I just moved on. So I'm going to pause and then say, thanks for sharing what you just shared. And so we kind of did it overly, like over the top. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. But you really get a lot of interesting insights about not just how are you as a podcaster, but what are your facilitation strengths? What are your facilitation opportunities to grow? What are your weird verbal tics? What are your cadences that sound good for listeners? When do you sound super boring? When do you sound like way too excited? So I don't listen to every episode of the podcast that I do now. John does. Some people are super weirded out. They're like, man, I don't listen to myself. I just record it and upload it. But I would highly encourage anyone who does a podcast to at least regularly listen. And I do regularly listen to probably one in every 3 or 4 episodes. And it's really insightful. It's really insightful. There's probably no better way to get feedback for yourself than to listen to yourself.
That makes a lot of sense. I've even seen myself have that same experience. And so, of the two things you said, one of them was generally that it's made you a better communicator because you're more aware of how you're actually talking with people since you're listening back. And the other thing is, because you have distilled knowledge, distilled explanations from these conversations in the podcast, you've been able to just reference certain episodes rather than having to do it again. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
That's cool. That's
Yeah.
cool.
And I forget sometimes, but it has been cool. I'm like, no, actually, check out, we just had this long talk about this. If you wanted more thoughts, check out my episode on this, in a sales call. So the more you do it, the more content you have. And, I don't know if somebody listens to it, but everything matters when you're trying to build relationship with somebody in a business, right? A lot of, most businesses, almost all, everything is relational on some level. So if you're working on a client you're trying to work with, and they see that you do a podcast, well, that's like a little bit of, okay, well, this guy is serious. He's not just fallen out of bed and decided to be a consultant today. He's invested. So those little signals are important. I think they are for a lot of people. And so finding natural ways to incorporate it, or you get ideas, right? You're like, oh, shoot, we haven't talked about that. Could we talk about this on our podcast? Yeah, why not? It's our podcast. So there's a lot of ways it can go, but yeah, the natural ways it slides into things without feeling pressure to kind of market it has been interesting to think about, even as I'm sharing this with you.
Final question.
All right.
If you were talking to another founder who just started their business maybe a year ago, similar to you, and they're making their podcast at the same time, what advice would you be dying to give them, and distill it into 1 or 2 sentences?
Have a clear and meaningful reason why you're doing it that's not just about likes, and use Riverside or something like it. Don't do it with another outside of an online tool.
I think that's sound advice. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate you. This has been Founder Podcast Lab. See you in the next episode.